what is the government currently doing to the in-service fleet in New Zealand to encourage gas guzzling, less safe, polluting vehicles to exit the fleet? The industry here is well poised to supply replacement vehicles, but at the end of the day, we need to get the motoring public in a frame of mind to look at turning their vehicles over and exiting these vehicles so that we can provide cost-effective and, as you want to call it, cleaner vehicles into the fleet as a replacement.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and I'm totally open to looking at that. I think that the rationale for starting with economy standards and some incentives to influence the vehicles at the point they're coming to import is that if we didn't do that first and we were encouraging people to buy new cars, right now they'd be buying cars that are probably worse for the climate than they were 10 years ago, at least in terms of brand new cars. And I forgot to mention that one of the great things I think about us mainly importing cars from Japan is that Japan has had really stringent fuel economy standards all this time. So a lot of the secondhand imports we're getting in are way more efficient than what they would have been if we were relying on New Zealand's active standards. But I think that we have to start with the vehicles that are coming at the point of import, ensure that we've got some bottom lines there in terms of fuel economy, some targets to get to, some incentives, and then I think the next round of it would be looking at the in-service fleet, because eventually we're going to have to bite that off, right? But the other thing that David mentioned I meant to address and I forgot to was about the point about people holding onto their vehicles for longer. I don't know if that could happen. Don't we already hold on to our vehicles for about as long as we possibly could in New Zealand? I don't think that could get much worse.
Good evening. My name's Peter Johnston, and I've been in the industry since 1987. I am one of the original founders with Rod Milner over here, and we actually formed the BIA. And the first thing I'd like to say tonight is I'm really proud of how the BIA, it was in those days called the IMVDA, but how our used car industry has evolved and brought better and safer vehicles into New Zealand. And we really understand that we need to upgrade our fleet for a lot of reasons. I think the biggest worry we've got, we're a big business. We're a big employer. We employ over 5,000 people in our used segment. And it's very easy to add up, from the shipping companies and the compliance companies and the transport and all the stuff that goes around and getting a car ready to go on the New Zealand road. So the big fear for us is, we've got big infrastructures in place to handle cars and volume, and we see our volumes disintegrating in front of our eyes, especially with ESC coming along, but that's another topic. But I think the biggest fear for me is you've got to have some balance. And yes, you want to achieve a better fleet and a green fleet, a clean fleet, but you must have balance, because on the other economy of scale, it could have quite drastic effects on employment in New Zealand and infrastructure. So be careful. I'm just asking you, I've talked to your colleague tonight, you've got to look at the balance, because we can go hard out here, but we might do a lot of damage on the other side of the fence. So I really beg you to be careful and to have balance. I think really, at the end of the day, may I say or not, many years ago, we've talked about having a rolling age ban. David, we've talked about that. And maybe that's the thing to consider in the future. We do need to get, unfortunately, New Zealand are car lovers, car hoarders, and they hang on their cars for a long time. And it may be you have to put something like in place that as the car gets older, its registration goes up and forces them out. And a very similar thing happens in Japan, where that's why we were able to buy cars for many years and still goes on. That after a car gets 3 years old in Japan, it's quite high to register. So just off the top of my head, I think it was something like 300,000 yen, probably about $4,000, to register your car after 3 years. So it forced you actually to go and buy a new car. And that's where we picked up both. We're buying, over the years we've bought beautiful cars, 20Ks, 30Ks, because of the Japanese. They forced their people to keep on buying new cars and made it more, economy of scale. Hey, it was better to go and buy a new car than pay $3,000 to register the car for another 3 years. So maybe that's the thing you can look at. As the car gets older, maybe you put the registration up, and so it forces those older cars off the road, or you may be looking at a rolling year. And again, may I say it, but it might be a more efficient way and not affect the market as much. So really what I'm saying to you is be careful. Have you looked at the employment factor of our industry? $1 billion industry. We employ over 5,000 people. Just be careful that you don't put a lot of people out of work. Thank you.
Well, I can assure you that none of my ministerial colleagues would accept any policies that were going to have a major threat to employment. And that's certainly, I would be very, very concerned if that were seen as a likely outcome of fuel economy standards. I'm not suggesting that's not what you're saying.
No, what I'm saying is with ESC and now
with ESC.
And this proposal for 2021, I think it could have a big effect on volumes of cars coming in.
Maybe I should just talk a little bit about the detail of our proposals. I can't speak to the impact that ESC is going to have right now, but I'm very much looking forward to getting into that issue, starting when we get back to Wellington tomorrow. But with the clean car standard, it doesn't even start in 2021. In 2021, we start asking you to keep track of the average fuel economy, or, the vehicles that you're bringing in and what their fuel economy is. And then in 2022, it starts stepping down, so you have targets to sell more efficient vehicles relative to inefficient. And as I said, that doesn't just mean selling more small cars and fewer large cars, because there are efficient versions. There's a different standard depending on the weight class of the vehicle. And we're aiming to get to a standard in 2025 that is comparable to what the average fuel economy in Japan was in 2014. So it should be possible to source vehicles from Japan that are 5 to 10 years old that would meet the standard. That shouldn't be that challenging. Really, I actually think it'll be, and I don't think it'll be that challenging for the new car industry either, because they have efficient models that they have to sell, that they sell in other jurisdictions, because most countries have fuel economy standards. So the cars exist, the demand is there. What we don't want is to end up getting the least efficient cars because they're the most profitable for the manufacturers. And that's really the point of having the standard and moving in that direction. And again, and the fee-bait, the little subsidy kind of fee thing, is all about ensuring and giving you confidence that we can help build that demand for the more efficient vehicles. But we know from research that people just don't make decisions as much about the car based on what the future running costs are. And that's why there's a role for, that's why fuel economy standards and fee-baits are the right place to put the market signal. If we just put it on the ETS, on the cost of fuel, we would have to have a cripplingly high petrol price to influence the vehicles people are buying. And at that point, most people have already bought their vehicles, they're not buying a new vehicle in the next 5 years. The only option they have is to stop driving, which is not good, especially if we don't have the alternatives there in place, which is why we're working on investing in some alternatives like public transport. But so I hear what you're saying about balance, and I would humbly suggest that the proposal that we're putting in is very balanced. I can assure you that my former colleague who's the head of Greenpeace New Zealand told me, oh, yeah, nice work, it's very modest. So, I mean, from the perspective of people who care about climate change and doing something, they don't see this as radical or ambitious at all. They see it as possibly a little too slow. Other jurisdictions are starting to legislate an end date to the importation of petrol and diesel vehicles. They've already got a better average fuel economy than what we're aiming at in 5-6 years' time.
Probably more comments than questions. As a relatively new Zealander sitting on the sideline of the game of politics, one of the things, and having the fortunate opportunity to be at the coalface of this industry, one of the things that always confuses me with our current coalition government is the drive, and not a single person in this room would disagree with the need to leave our planet in a better condition, but the coalition's government's drive to force cargo away from the point of consumption, and in this respect I'm talking about cars to Norfolk.
Oh, right.
But all we're doing is adding carbon to the travel cost of that vehicle's return to the point of consumption. So I think that there's possibly something in what you said about the government's incentive for a short-term view of things, and maybe it's a challenge to our current government to look long-term. If we are really looking to reduce our carbon footprint, then pushing the message about the movement of vehicles 200 plus kilometres up the road when they travel 20 kilometres to point of consumption flies in the face of that. On the feedback rebate scheme, the one thing I would ask, and again it's that scratching my head at the question, as we feed one group of vehicles and we rebate another, over time it is natural that the balance of that scale will start shifting to where we want it. But then as that balance shifts, the consumption of fossil fuels reduces. Great. But in every litre of fossil fuel we sell in New Zealand today, a good proportion is tax. So as the tax starts drying up, is it inevitable that we replace it with an EV or alternative vehicle ruck?
Yeah. Yeah, we've known for a long time that we have to have an alternative to petrol tax. And already diesel vehicles don't pay at the pump, they pay road user charges. I wouldn't argue that our current road user charges scheme is as nuanced as it should be if we're going to move to all vehicles, and there is an opportunity there to do more time of use charging as well, to deal with congestion as well as the cost of building and maintaining the infrastructure. So yes, I mean, we know, and the RUC exemption for EVs was always going to expire in 2021, and that's when we're looking at introducing the price incentive then to be at the point of sale of the vehicle, because we know the RUC exemption probably was mainly done because they weren't ready to figure out the mechanism for assessing it from EVs. The tricky one is actually the plug-in hybrids, because they're paying some petrol tax, but they might not be, and it's hard to know exactly how much they're paying. So that's where having a real live time GPS, real-time charging mechanism would be beneficial, because you would have a sense of how much they're using the roads. As to your first point, so before I went into politics, I was a transport planner, so I'm very interested in the logistics questions and how we get a greener outcome from the movement of freight around New Zealand. And I completely agree that if all of the cars and or other containers were to be offloaded up at Marsden Point and moved onto trucks on the road down, that would be a terrible outcome. I think that there is hope in that there'll be revitalization of the North Auckland line, but I also understand that it's not super straightforward. There's going to have to be, because of the growth of passenger movements on the rail line in Auckland, and that's growing quite fast, there's some competition between freight and passenger, and it's not obvious, other than running things in the middle of the night, how you get it through Auckland, unless you built some, alternative line that wasn't carrying so many of the passengers. I'm open-minded. I like to be convinced by the evidence, so I'm open-minded about the North Island port study and what it suggests where we could get gains or not. And I do understand there are trade-offs. I know Tony won't like to hear this, but there are a lot of urbanists who would love to see an opportunity for more living in and around the harbour in Auckland. But I've always been partial to the argument that this is the best location and most of the goods are within Auckland that are coming in, so.
Thank you, Minister. One last question.
I should have acknowledged you, David.
That's all right. Look, I just want to address the ESC question here, and this is going to be quite provocative, but you guys should stop whinging. We know that ESC, in 2012, over 1 million vehicles in Japan with ESC, so there's more than enough for you. This is the biggest safety gain, and you're going on and you're complaining about that. This is what is killing people, cars without ESC, so get over it and just adjust. I really am quite angry because where is your moral compass on safety if you're whinging about you can't bring in cars with ESC? Just, for God's sake, grow up.
Dave, we're not whinging, we're just saying this is what's going to happen. And we accepted it was done, the deal was done 7 years ago.
Well, stop complaining and adjust.
No, we're not complaining, we're just explaining what's going to happen.
Coming on to tonight's things.
Now I'm in trouble.
Look, Minister, I mean, my assessment is I do agree that the fuel standard is going to hit the new car sector much harder than the used cars.
But there are plenty of efficient new cars.
There are plenty of efficient new cars, but I think here, what I wanted to comment is actually to the used car sector. I don't think there is a lot of gremlins in the system for used cars under the fuel economy standard, because they have the option of picking and choosing. And when you look at the market, most of the market, about 70% of it is Class MA vehicles under 2 litres in size. So I don't think it's a big worry for them, although we'll be working with them in terms of the submission and trying to get an industry response. But certainly there are some challenges in the standard for the new car sector. Having a look at the detail, if we don't adjust the bands and CO2 ratings for the band, already my preliminary assessment is that it's in the tens of millions, getting close to $100 million cost to the new car sector in terms of the penalty. So, and it's not surprising, the ones that aren't paying it initially aren't the used. It's actually some of the small cars. And so we haven't quite got the gradient right on it if you're going to press ahead with it. Yeah. There are some significant issues around WLTP, which is the measure that they want, and that there are different rates in how that is calculated between Japan, who uses medium, low and high. Extra high is calculated at 130 k's, we don't have 130 k's speed limit here. Yeah. We have some proposals around how to standardise it so it's neutralised between Europe, Japan, new and used. There are some big issues around what rates and definitions and how the data is collected. So the detail is not to be I guess overlooked. There are some really big issues in it, but fundamentally I guess the bit that we disagree with as an industry, whether it's new or used, is that as an industry we are totally demand driven in the way in which we source our vehicles. The idea that you have around that we don't bring in some of the models that are available overseas, there are some genuine reasons why that is not possible to do. It's not because we don't want to. Sometimes we do and they don't sell. Sometimes they aren't made to the standards or homologated for our market, and our market is pretty small, 0.13% of global, so it is very small. So there are not some insignificant challenges in this. So we certainly will be engaging. You've heard my comments. I think I was very modest in our reaction.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I thank the used car guys for inviting me here. And look, rolling age ban, I think I addressed it. I don't think banning cars based on star ratings is a good idea. Anyone who promotes that, I think, should just go home, because you can't get, they're all different. But we're willing to have some discussions about rolling age ban as a backdoor to standards. Standards first, certain age ban, and then after that. If you think, Minister, that we haven't held on to our cars long enough, I can show you a graph that says we've got a horror story coming.
But if you're worried about the regressive impacts of policies, I would say a rolling age ban should be one that you should be worried about what the impact on low-income households will be.
Well, no, that's not correct. But I'll take that offline.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, yeah, appreciate the feedback. Again, if we genuinely think, if the importers are independent from Australia, and we're not just being sold the same thing Australia is, then we should have some flexibility to have a fuel economy standard. And most of the left-hand drive countries do have fuel economy standards. They've made it work. There's no shortage of car sales in California or the UK, Japan. They're different markets, but that's I guess what I'm asking you. Like, I think that the standard's actually going to help you, because anyone who wants to do the right thing and wants to sell more fuel-efficient cars, if there's not a standard, they might be facing competition from people who find it easier to sell the less efficient version. So really, the standard helps everyone get to where we need to go. And I'm really, really open to hearing advice about tweaking the detail of these policies to make sure that they work and they get the outcome we want.
Thank you, Minister. Can I have a round of applause, please, for our Julie Anne Genter. It's fair to say that the motor vehicle industry in New Zealand is one of both certainly resilience, secondly independence, and thirdly absolute pragmatism. And some of the questions I think you face tonight are born not from criticism, but they're born from pragmatism. With an industry now, certainly a used sector that's celebrating close to its 30th year of importing used vehicles from other jurisdictions. And so if nothing we've learned during that time is both the resilience, but the need to be pragmatic and look for solutions to the issues that we face on an ongoing basis. And I'd like to think tonight you've heard some of those concerns, but also got a taste of the pragmatism the industry is also willing to offer as well. So we thank you tonight for coming out to the wilds of Henderson and embracing the train to make its way out here as well. And we respect you taking a car home tonight as well. So thank you very much once again. Associate Minister of Transport, Julie Anne Genter, thank you very much.